Pathways to Planetary Health is about how we address contemporary issues, how we align ourselves and other systems that we help generate with Earth. In a regenerative society, the theme of this dialogue can restore and maintain balance. This is especially important during periods of rapidly unfolding transformation. As I hear so many individuals and groups seek to make change, and also as I hear them undergo change, I believe regenerative systems can be a source of nourishment, of replenishing reserves, and a source of creating the conditions for planetary health. So welcome to the afternoon session on regenerative society and economies for the common good. So thanks again for being here with us as we explore these ideas. And to kick things off, I'd like to invite each speaker to share brief remarks, and then we'll have a conversation and we'll open it up for the audience as well. Over to you, Amanda.
How can I do good and do well? Obviously, intuitively, we feel like there shouldn't be a tension there. But as David Graeber, rest in peace, a brilliant man, found that in countries like this one, the majority of people feel like they have a job that need not or should not exist. Yeah? A job that is contributing nothing to society or actively making it worse off. It feels like there's an almost inverse relationship between how much you get paid and how much you're contributing to society. So the most exploitive and damaging activities and behaviors seem to garner billions, whereas the kind of work that holds this world together, which is really centered in compassion and care and generosity, is often paid nothing at all. And I think it's important to recognize that there's nothing inevitable about this system, but it is really a reflection of a particular evolution in the history of economic thought. Because somewhere along the way, we developed a pretty crazy assumption that when it comes to producing and providing for one another, we're all inherently selfish, individualistic, rational assholes, and somehow that's a good thing, yeah? And so with that, as a result of that, we have gone about encouraging and rewarding particular kinds of behavior in our society. And we can see this in, the research that has found that, I think it's over a quarter of Fortune 500 CEOs exhibit clinically psychopathic traits, right? And and that makes sense. They're the perfect economic man. They're devoid of compassion and empathy and consideration of others. And so in many ways, this economic paradigm has led us to glorify psychopathic behavior, or at least legitimize this idea that taking as much for ourselves as possible is somehow going to leave everybody better off. And of course, it's not working out that way. Not only is our entire ecosystem collapsing, but we're all miserable, yeah, with anxiety and depression just spreading across the globe, with the WHO now finding it being the leading cause of disability now worldwide. But things are shifting. So in the theme of metamorphosis, we're seeing this paradigm shift with people really calling for change. And across the G20 countries, right, even in our current economic terms, 74% of people believe that the economy should be working in a way that directly supports the health and well-being of people and planet rather than just generating profits and wealth. And that's huge, right? This is the heart of what we call the well-being economy movement, this recognition that people and planet aren't here to serve the economy is here to serve us. And we're starting to see an incredible amount of leaders and governments and institutions from the local to the global starting to heed that call. And so, for example, we have the well-being economy governments, which includes Scotland, Finland, Iceland, Wales, and Canada, who have all developed alternative metrics to GDP, centered in social and ecological well-being. So to have that new North Star of progress. And what that opens up for us then is an opportunity to shine a light on the regenerative economic practices, on the employee-owned and cooperative and commons-based governance systems that can truly ensure that we're producing and providing in a way that delivers a more just and sustainable world. And so if I leave you with anything, I think it's just to remind you that we are the economy. We created this system. We can redesign it. And I believe it's possible to build a system that encourages the the best as opposed to the worst parts of us, so that there isn't such a conflict between doing good and doing well. Thanks.
Why do we need societal transformation? And I'm here as a physician, not an economist, to say we need societal transformation because our lives and the rest of life on Earth depends on it. And that insight comes out of a field that's really kind of flourished only in the last 8 years called planetary health, which is where I do my work. And the sort of core insight of the field is that this global Earth crisis that we, in our collective activities, are driving, this crisis of climate change, the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth, land use change, destruction of marine systems, and on, has gotten to a scale and is growing at a pace that now is driving a global health and humanitarian crisis. That what we've considered for decades to be environmental problems are now human survival and social justice problems. And a central tenet of the field is that the scale collectively of humanity's entire ecological footprint, of all of our activities collectively, exceeds our planet's capacities, either to absorb our wastes or to produce the resources that we're using sustainably. And as a result, we, in our everyday little decisions, are changing the global climate system, driving the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth, driving pollution of air, water, and soil, changing land use and land cover, altering biogeochemical cycles, driving scarcity of resources like fresh water and arable land, and that all of these large global scale systems changes perpetuated by our activities are interacting with each other now in very complex ways that we're just starting to understand, but that affect the foundational qualities for human health and well-being, the quality of the air that we breathe, the quality and quantity of food that we can produce, access to fresh water, exposure to infectious diseases, exposure to extreme weather events, and increasingly the habitability of many of the places where we live. And as a result, we are now seeing direct impacts of these environmental changes, these biophysical changes on human health across every dimension of health, mental health being an enormously important and tends to be an overlooked one. I think it's 50% of 18 to 25-year-olds in 10 countries around the world, both rich and poor, are on a daily basis suffering anxiety, depression, mental health effects, thinking about climate change. That eco-anxiety is at a scale that's really extraordinary. Mental health, nutrition and food scarcity, infectious disease exposure, the non-communicable diseases, things like heart disease, respiratory disease, cancers, and displacement and conflict, all are being driven by our own transformation of our planet's natural system. So we're seeing this enormous global health crisis associated with the Earth crisis. And when we step back and say, if that's the diagnosis, then the treatment has to be rapid, structural, transformational change in how we live in order to reduce that ecological footprint, to protect and regenerate our natural life support system.
In the wake of World War II and the dismantling of the fascist Nazi regime, the UN General Assembly issued the landmark Declaration of Human Rights, including economic rights, in 1948. This is the 75th anniversary, so we should keep that in mind. Human rights were defined and described as universal and related to human dignity, and nation states had a responsibility to deliver those rights. The UN Declaration included civil rights, political rights, social rights, cultural rights, and economic rights. A 21st century iteration of this economic rights would learn from the failures of exclusion from the past by emphasizing that we design, implement, and manage these economic rights with intentional inclusivity or affirmative inclusivity for all social groups, races, genders, ethnicities, nation states, et cetera. In isolation, or a subset of human rights, are not only inadequate, they are a co-optation of the notion of rights and freedom. If we think about the ability to collectively organize or vote when you're hungry, when you're without a home, again, that's a co-optation of what freedom and justice is. So we need industrial policy that centers people and the environments in which they live, not as a charitable, not in a charitable sense, but in a productive sense, that this enables a dynamism by which we all can benefit. And I could say a whole lot about that. And also, if we think about foreign policy, this is the best foreign policy we could put forth. It would promote tranquility. It would lead to less volatility as it relates to migration. And we have examples like the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe at the end of World War II. But unfortunately, that Marshall Plan was not extended globally.
I come from a policy background, so I want to be honest about this in terms of some of the ways I think about these transformations. But Wales is one of my favorite examples. I don't know if people are familiar with their Future Generations Act, but they went through a process of asking all their citizens, what kind of Wales do you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? And on that basis, they identified these 7 long-term well-being goals, which were centered around biodiversity, conservation, health, equity, global responsibility, et cetera. But what was really transformative to me, and why I talk about it a lot, is that a lot of governments set these indicators and then nothing happens. But in this legislation, they also had these principles of governance reform and new ways of working, and really it's new ways of thinking. And the first one was about taking a longer term perspective. So rather than just constantly reacting to the short-term crisis of the day or growing the economy so we can take some of that wealth to fix the damages that are done to people and planet in the process, right? To really think a little more longer term and to take that preventative approach. And so that's the second principle, was prevention. So the government not just being here to deal with crises, but to actually prevent them in line with those goals. And the third and fourth were around integration and collaboration. And I think a lot of what we're hearing today as a theme is related to this. It's about the breaking down of silos, of recognizing that in order to achieve health, it's not just the health ministry. You need the environmental and the transport and the economic, and you need all of them to be working collectively towards the achievement of these goals and to be held accountable for that as well when they're doing their thinking. And the last principle is, I think, really important, is around participation. Because I think one of the biggest issues I see is the shape and form of corporate globalization has made most of us feel like we don't have any voice or agency over the decisions that impact our livelihoods. And so making sure that people are actively engaged in developing the strategies and informing that.
I think in our political economy, our greatest power is people power. And if there are democracies and the ability to have influence on how you're governed and how you're structured, the wedge issue that prevents us from doing a lot of the things that are being proposed up here is the capacities to divide people and offer some dominant group relative status, to say however bad your lot in life may be, at least you're not them. And we see it across time, if not explicitly, almost implicitly. So, real quick, I'll make this point, which is abortion, a big issue right now. Obviously, it is restrictive of people's reproductive rights, particularly women, which should be essential and not questioned. Why is it such a big issue in certain places? I frankly don't think those that are really pushing it care so much about it per se, but it's a wedge issue. It becomes a strategy, a mechanism within this microcosm. And I'm spending time on it just to make the point that we have to grapple with that. We have to, if we want something different, we really do have to come up with alternatives for all of us that provide pathways so that lure towards fascism, racism, et cetera, isn't so potent.
The good news is we've seen a ton of human development over the last 75 years. I think there also are sort of marginalized communities who already have a worldview. We heard about this morning often from indigenous communities, from some faith traditions, that is much more integrative and that has a much more sort of regenerative and holistic way of looking at the world, but those views have been so marginalized that what they need is not to be marginalized, right? Not, so it depends who the we is, but for dominant society, I agree, a lot of these problems are power problems, and how do you address power problems? You need to build power, and how do you build power? You need to do movement building. So I think that is core to a lot of the change. I think that there are roles for other things like new knowledge and technological developments that give us a new path forward, so we have something to change to. So I think it's complex, but I do think power is at the heart of a lot of it.
For me, one of the things when I'm thinking about this larger point of metamorphosis and the fact that I think so many people here are coming from very different spheres, but thinking about this sort of paradigm shift is any systems change requires us to not only nurture and grow the new, but also allow for the dying and the hospicing of the old, right? And I think that in my lifetime in economics, like I started studying economics when neoclassical economics, that sort of, everything is governed by these natural laws and a lot of assumptions around human nature, et cetera, like that was the dominant. If you were a heterodox economist, anybody who was questioning this, ecological economists, feminist economists, et cetera, you were like out in a field somewhere talking to yourself, nobody cared. But then the financial crisis happened, and we didn't allow for the hospicing of those systems that didn't work, but it did create this opening where all of a sudden these new economic paradigms and ideas were being invited into the discussion and were being seen as valid. And it reminds me of the Leonard Cohen quote, right? Like everything has a crack because those cracks are what let the light in.
I'm really interested in economic and finance paradigm shifting work, and I think that work is inherently a contemplative act because part of it involves shedding a lot of our inherited beliefs, our inherited training, kind of status quo logic. So I'm really interested in spaces that can bring together, fuse together spiritual and contemplative practices in life with kind of systems transformation work. I was really inspired by what Amanda Janou was saying around the need to not just sort of catalyze new ways of thinking and acting, but also hospicing the old. And I thought that connected really beautifully with some of the reflections in the first part of the day around contemplation as an act of surrender. Like, it's very hard to let go. And so how can we let go with grace and intentionality in order to make space for that which is uncertain, that which is maybe uncomfortable or new to emerge?
There's so much incredible wisdom here today. We wanted to create an experiential opportunity here, so thank you for showing up. It takes great courage to lead with our hearts, and so thank you for being people of the heart.
My understanding is that that's what actually they're inviting us to do. They're just showing us, this is the job. We need to get a big blasting fire going, like big humanity essence back on board. And then a lot of the issue and the stories that we build and tell ourselves will be totally relevant. We all know when you sit around the fire, it's very mesmerizing and you just forget about everything else. It's like, oh, that's it. And so should we lit the fire? Are you ready?
So this is beautiful timing, brother. As we are lighting the fire, may we welcome you to offer a blessing.
I don't think I can do that. It's like saying, I grow the garden, but it's not true. The garden grows you. So the garden is blessing you already. We just have to recognize it, because I'm not authorized to bless anything. I'm authorized to recognize the blessing. Because I'm not so, how do you say it? non-Western. So we just have to acknowledge that we're being already blessed instead of thinking I carry the power to bless.
In January of this year, 115 tribes in Colombia gathered, and they've asked us to come and share this story. So we'll do our elders the best that we can in this moment. And many of these tribes throughout their history have been warring tribes, but they came together and found a space of love, a space of peace. And through ceremony, many days of ceremony, and it took many days, for some came from the mountains and from the waters and from deep in the jungle. And representatives from each tribe came, and women and children and men came together and sat by the fire. And the Colombian Council of Elders, there's an indigenous council of sages of Colombia, have put out a kahea, a call to humanity, an invitation. And the invitation is to synchronize indigenous ceremony around the world. The purpose is to elevate the frequency on Earth, and not in some airy-fairy way, to support us in accessing realms of intelligence, realms of understanding, realms of our connection, so we can find our way forward. For the elders have been teaching us that it's not through our minds, and as we heard from some of our elders today, it's not through our minds, certainly not our minds alone. It is through the heart and through our awakened hearts that we will have access to greater understanding. And so you are all part of this, you are all welcome as we take steps to support the bridging that's happening around the world. Peoples have been in ceremony all the time. The ceremony is nothing new. This motion of synchronizing ceremony across all peoples is just one expression of what's part of the transformation, the metamorphosis that we're all part of.
I think what has been exciting for me has been some of the slight reframes of language and thinking, some of the shifting from nouns to verbs and shifting the dynamic between, who has the power. And we were just in a session where one of the indigenous elders was asked to give a blessing, and he immediately said, it's not for me to give a blessing, it's for me to acknowledge the blessing that it is giving to us. And it just, those kind of inverting the assumptions and the way some of us naturally think, and it has opened up kind of new ways of thinking for me.
I think Denmark is quite close to being a commons economy, but there is obviously a question about, in a way, my question is looking at what is not in the interest of the common. In other words, wherever either the private interest or state interest are dominating the common interest. That for me is a good question, because I see in Denmark, for example, yes, the state is involved, which gives it scale. At the same time, the state is as good as you can find in terms of working for the commons.
And there's different state behaviors. Look at the US government incubating the protocols that allowed the internet to take off. That was a fantastic open service. They were not capturing it. On the other hand, there's nothing that more delights a capitalist as to dominate a commons and turn it into a private market the way Facebook and Twitter did for social media. Those should be public utility commons and not privately owned, which we've seen the manipulations that occur when that happens. So that's the point I wanted to stress, is that inbuilt to every commons preemptively has to be a means to protect itself from appropriation.
In the US legal system, ultimately it's in the interest of individuals, individual rights. And in Europe now, we've seen now in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Denmark, civil society taking the government to court and winning the case. Or now taking actually individual directors of Shell have been sued by civil society for not actually doing what a company should be doing. So that's kind of common interest versus the interest of individuals, which is actually quite, and there is a lot, growing. I think even Portugal, there were 30 young people, 18 years old, went to the European Court of Justice to take the government of Portugal to court for not sticking to the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
So we see how can you use the law to enforce common rights.
Well, Europe is far more advanced in even offering something like that. I mean, we've seen how the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down class action, the scope of class action lawsuits. So it's very difficult here to get protection for collective interest. And, you know, the whole history of, I'm sorry?
A group of young people in Montana recently were successful.
Yes, but that under the public trust doctrine, but they failed in 40 other states before that one came through. The public trust doctrine is a notoriously slippery, squishy, with a lot of judicial discretion. But I mean, it's great that they were able to parlay that into that victory.
Yeah.
Yes. To speak in reverse, it's notable that Native Americans, in the course of becoming one of the conditions for them to become American citizens under the so-called Dawes Act was to surrender their collective ways of being and ownership and own individual property and become individuals. And so that tells it all. And so this is maybe a frontier challenge is for the state to recognize certain collective interests. You know, the state does charter corporations as collective interests as market players, parentheses. They don't charter commons. They do charter, you know, co-ops, but under very specialized terms, and they're essentially market players more than social collective action.
We're thinking about compassion, thinking a lot about collective healing, the science of interconnection, where Dan's work was really central. So that's where the notion of relational sense making came from. This idea that we can double down on really tending to and paying attention to all of our relationships. My relationship right now to this space, my relationship right now to my body, my relationship right now to you all, my relationship right now to the city, my relationship to this country, to this globe, to this universe. And leverage that tiered awareness to be more present with you. And what that presence can do in the quality of our relationship, in terms of how you might perceive that presence, in terms of how it listens to you, how you listen to me. And then that exchange, maybe, just maybe, we could exchange the ways in which we make sense of this world in a way that might make us feel more grounded. The concept is really basic. It's just, we're turning to the practice of engaging in a deeper kind of listening around how we're making sense of the world. And part of what we're noticing in the academic research, if we need any kind of reformation, is that things that generate healing, increased well-being, and our resilience is processes that allow us to make meaning of the world around us. The moment we are isolated from community, or isolating our relationships, and we don't have other people to make meaning, that's the foundation for depression, for loneliness. So we'd love to hear some of you in terms of how are you making sense of today, and maybe what came out of your conversation with each other. I have a mic here, I can bring it to you.
This has been a really great experience so far for me because first, I'm coming all the way from Jersey. I was born in New York, so I was used to an MTA experience of trains being late, dirty, the crime, everything. But instead of sitting in that, when I got here, it put me in a different frame of mind because I practice mindfulness, but sometimes it just gets beyond me. I get a little overwhelmed by different circumstances that happen to me. But so coming here, having these little breakout conversations with different people that I meet, it really helped me to focus on the present, what I'm experiencing right now, being in this space of positivity. So I think just the sense of community, it means a lot to me.
I was a principal in the New York City public education system, and they introduced mindfulness and told me to close my eyes and breathe, I told him, you're crazy. You know? The minute I close my eyes and breathe, all chaos is going to fall in my building. Right? All hell is going to break loose. I don't have the time to do that. And then later on, I started thinking, what kind of a building am I running that I can't stop and breathe? You keep saying the system isn't broken, but the system isn't broken. It's designed to do exactly what it's doing to have the outcome that you are experiencing, which is stress, anxiety, and depression. That's how the education system is designed. So it brings us talking about the next topic that keeps coming up today, right? Which is about well-being. The 4 pillars of well-being talks about insight, awareness, purpose, and connection. But when you look at them, they're seen as individual pieces and they don't really come together as one thing that is connected. So there are 4 different precepts and concepts that we talk about with awareness. So the first thing that we talk about within the mandala and within well-being that we've been talking about, and within metamorphosis, because we're all changing. And I started out telling you my changes, because I started out in a different realm from where I am now. And so when we think about perceptual awareness and we think about Richard Davidson's work around awareness, we're talking about mindfulness, we're talking about meta-awareness, we're talking about just being conscious of everything that's coming into our senses, right? And when we talk about perceptual awareness and we talk about SEL, we're also talking about the concept within SEL of the intra. SEL. Social emotional learning. So we're talking about what's happening internally that we're trying to kind of figure out what's going on, because they kind of break up social emotional learning into 2 places. What's happening inside of you and what's happening outside of you, which is the intra perception. So that's perceptual awareness. And if we think about the practice of like mindfulness, John Gabrielli, who is the leading scientist at the McGovern Institute in MIT, phenomenal, most acclaimed brain scientist who doesn't believe necessarily in doing a contemplative practice, did research and said that if mindfulness was a drug, it would be ripped off the shelves of every pharmacy.
I wonder what work you've done to kind of take away from this idea that it's on us, because yeah, of course, if I can recycle, I can. If I can compost, I will. But when 100 corporations are causing, like the vast majority of damage to our planet, it feels a little bit silly when I hear people say, oh, but I'm doing this, and they feel like that is what all they can do, when it's really not on us as individuals. It's not our responsibility when we aren't the main polluters. We can do what we can, but it's a lot bigger than us to a certain extent.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think that individual behavior change is not going to solve the problem. There's a scale problem there, right? And as you say, and so our choice of carrying around our metal straws instead of our plastic straws is not going to meaningfully address climate change. It's also true that adopting these behavior changes is a first step in kind of a practice, of a commitment, of an identity, which is important. So I think it can be a starting point, but it can't be an end point, because ultimately these problems, as we've been discussing, are power problems and collective action problems. And so until you have collective action, and this goes to the conversation we were just having in plenary about restructuring the economy, right? You need rules. We're not going to get from here to there through individual behavior change. We actually have to regulate industries. We might need a price on carbon, or we might need, whatever those rules are going to be. We want to, save fisheries. shaming people about, you just ate the last tuna in the sea, like that's probably not gonna get us there, whereas banning fishing on tuna and, monitoring fisheries might actually really help. So I think you need policy and you need a regulatory environment. But you also do need an educated constituency that is going to demand that kind of policy and vote for those kinds of politicians and put pressure on businesses to change their business practices, right? So it's that sort of three-legged stool of, an enlightened constituency, enlightened policy, and then pressure on businesses to act in different ways.
As we've heard today, part of the great change we are witnessing now and participating in has to do with waking up from the illusion that we are separate beings, separate from our origins, separate from one another, separate from the earth. But if we're not separate, where is it that resilience is to be found? And where is it located? If it's within us as individuals, it also has to be and is among us. And if it's among us, it must also be within our systems and within the fabric of life itself.
I think resilience, actually, to put it simply, succinctly, is really wellness under adversity, right? But holistic resilience is a much richer and much more complex idea, because in a way, it's a very interconnected web, like you said, of many different aspects of resilience that are really interactive, psychosomatic, and in many different layers and connections drive each other. So we're in the ecosystem with nature and humanity at a very broad level. And within nature, there are three aspects, I think, of resilience. One, very clearly, the natural environment. But much less recognized sometimes is also the non-sentient, which are kind of the land, the trees, the rocks, the rivers, the water, and air. So you've got, that is a very important planetary wellness under adversity, which is very much in a crisis situation right now. So we've got another very important group, which is kind of humanity. I guess all of us, brothers and sisters, right? And then also from a relationship standpoint, relational as well as social resilience, I guess is the we, you and I, we together. And that's actually often discounted in terms of how important the understanding of our relationship with our family, our friends, our colleagues, even people within countries or outside our ethnicities and humanity is. I think there's the inner part and then the external part and the inner part. And most of the discussion of resilience is kind of in the outer part and much less on the inner part. And if you look at physical, mental, as well as emotional, as well as spiritual, there's a lot more discussion in the mind and body and much less in the heart and soul. I think there are many conversations that have raised the importance of the feminine spirit. And as a masculine, I actually very much think that's the truth. And all these aspects of resilience are all interconnected together. But unfortunately, I think that this connection we have with all these elements of resilience is what's causing the polycrisis we have right now. Let's name a couple. I mean, the obvious one, climate warming, is this connection with the physical natural environment I talked about. But less obvious is really animals. I was just in another session, and I just heard about these statistics that kind of drove me crazy. Out of all the biomass on Earth, 6% are wild animals, and 94% are animals that we as humanity eats. Scary. And out of the 6% of wild animals, 5% of Earth's population oversee that 80% of that biodiversity, and those are indigenous people. Okay, so we as humanity really going to think we can continue this human-centric view of the world, which is driving the nature crazy, but in turn hurts humanity.
So the idea of all these things that, Victor, you're powerfully talking about, when we talk about, let's say, holistic resilience, the name of this gathering, right now, in the body that you have sitting in the chair, see if you can feel what it would mean for your body to be facing all the things you've heard even today, or things you may have heard in the news, or things going on over the last few months or last years, and see if you can feel what would you need to do in that body to have some kind of equanimity in the face of these challenging times. Just feel it in your body. You don't have to put any words to it, but just see what it would mean for you to have personal resilience, using the term personal for the individual and the individual body that you were born into. And notice I'm trying like mad to avoid the four-letter word, which I'm not going to tell you what it is. So now, here we are, all of us in this room, but just all of us in this auditorium now. See if you can feel right now, beyond the skin boundary of that body you're born into, see if you can feel the connection that lives within what Metta Bol and Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer, and when I met Angel for the first time, we would all call a relational field. See, and Angel's beautiful work on relational sense-making. See if you can sense into, right now in this room, the field beyond your skin that you actually belong to, here and now. See if you can just feel that. Even imaging it, which is the idea of imagining it, is fine, but see if you can also sense it. And if you can, just raise your hand if you can feel the connections among us. Raise your hand really, really high so you can see. So take a look, okay? Now that is a perceptual ability that is the basis of relational resilience, that we are not just in these bodies. And then see if you can feel, in fact, all human beings who live not just in this city or this state or this country, but our whole human family, as diverse as we are, distributed around this fragile and precious planet. And then see if you can extend that sense to all living beings and the natural environment that Victor was so beautifully inviting us to consider. And just see if you can feel it. And if you can feel that wholeness, not just that you are connected, between connected, but intra-connected, there's a wholeness to that whole system. See if you can just raise your hand and see if you feel that you are a member of life on Earth. Just raise your hand if you can feel it. Raise it really, really high. Open your eyes if they're closed and look around. And that is the basis of the sense-making of systems resilience. That you can feel a system beyond just the immediate relationship right here.
I want to somewhat disagree with Victor that we might be failing at engaging holistic resilience at the realm of spiritual, emotional, social, and physical, and even you mentioned the heart. Let me try. I know we're facing a lot, but I want to disagree that we are failing. And let me connect that to being grateful. I'm grateful for the first generation of slaves who held on with a sense that there would be a future that would be different, which would give birth to the abolitionist movement, a coalition of activists who dared to change one of the most closed and cruel systems in modern-day history. That resilience that it took to withstand over 400 years the extraction of one's labor, that's pretty resilient. I want to be grateful for the indigenous people, in particular in North America, who survived smallpox, who survived being removed from their territories, in many cases being forced to walk
thousands of miles, who would gradually be removed from not just territory, but from emotional and social safety nets, being put in boarding schools. The classic line was, "Save the man, kill the Indian." And yet, some of those communities are still here. That's quite resilient. I want to thank the women in the suffrage movement who dared to speak back to patriarchal rules and expectations around their role as second class, which gave birth to the women's movement, all imperfect, but has enabled us to maybe get a little closer to gender parity. I see that as resilient. I want to thank the Stonewall rioters and the trans women and trans men who dared to speak their truth and stand in their truth in the 1950s and 60s and 70s to allow for this generation now to be in full vogue. That is resilience to me. I can speak more around the folks who experienced disabilities and spoke up in the 1970s and led to the Disabilities Act. I can name countless movements that point to that we still have some fight in us, that the human spirit is still pretty strong. And I find it really interesting that we would call it human spirit. Human spirit and the role of spirit in helping these communities sustain some kind of commitment to change, some kind of commitment to metamorphosis. So part of the trickster in me, in disagreeing gently, I know that we are facing some real polycrises, is maybe to create a little more space around it as to not be too overwhelmed by the doom and gloom and ask a different question. Are there poly opportunities? Are there poly opportunities? And there's so much more I want to say, but I want to save time and just say that I'm grateful.
Opinion, and I'm sure that's shared by many, we won't achieve any real sustainable system shift if we don't address the financial sector and the financial institutions, the way they operate. And you can say the business sector as a whole, but that's a big term. And those four professionals who are working in the financial system or have worked in the financial system, so we want to really focus on that particular phenomena. And then also from the viewpoint, like, how do we really change? You know, of course, we can talk conceptually about change, metamorphosis, and spiritually, metaphorically, all that sort of thing. But then on the day-to-day level, you know, when you go into the office, you have to make changes, you have to make decisions. How do you do that?
I think we're stuck because we are trapped in a paradigm, a materialist, mechanistic, the world is a machine and we operate it to optimize the efficiency without even realizing that that's the paradigm we live in. And neoclassical economics is grounded in Newtonian physics. It was literally never updated to quantum physics, much less updated to systems ecology, cosmology, and our latest understanding of how biology works. So it's a bankrupt, outdated theory. And it's the theory that determines the water that we all swim in. And so to me, and I've spent now over a decade trying to figure out what a alternative paradigm looks like. And the only answer to me is the magic of life. Living systems have this really cool feature. They're living, they're not dead. The latest understanding from system science is virtually, it's highly aligned with our wisdom traditions. Eastern, Western, indigenous, all of them. For example, one of the principles I talk about is in right relationship. We've already heard that phrase used. That's system science and indigenous wisdom. So what are the chances of our human economy behaving as a healthy living system if we don't honor that in right relationship principle? But if you think about finance, in my career, in my lifetime, it's moved from a highly relational business. We used to call ourselves relationship bankers. Kind of sounds trite at this point. To a much more transactional business. And the people that run Wall Street firms now largely come out of a transactional trading side of the firm, not the relationship side of the firm. And so you have people making big decisions, getting to the decision making and leadership, whose brains have been affected by making very quick split level decisions to extract value, rather than contemplative type approaches. And these are mostly men who now run most of the big financial firms and hedge funds and private equity funds on planet Earth.
Until I moved to what's called the buy side, where you invest. I was a banker for 20 plus years at Bear Stearns, great firm, see you later. Credit Suisse was a great firm, see you later. Goldman Sachs, I think it's still going strong.
Less strong.
But a little less strong. I started a program called One Bank at Credit Suisse and One Goldman at Goldman, and the whole rationale for that was on 50 different desks or different banking units or financing units, everybody's trying to maximize their own profits. That's how they're going to get paid. That's how the shareholders are going to get dividends. That's what we're all taught in economics, maximize profits. But nobody looked at the system. Nobody looked at who are our biggest clients and are they growing with us? Who should be our biggest clients? What kind of impact are we having with our dollars from a philanthropic perspective, which clients care about, shareholders care about, board members care about. And so we needed to be more holistic, and so that was the whole idea, was to make sure that our biggest clients got the best of the firm and not just the best of each desk, or maybe even getting screwed by that desk, which happens a lot because they're trying to maximize profits and it's a zero-sum game. So we tried to make it less of a zero-sum game. I'm not so negative on Wall Street. I started with nothing. It gave me a lot. I do a lot with what it gave me. I think it's still there for people to have that experience. I'm a big believer, anybody heard of the expression karma cola? No. So I can't remember the book. I read it out of something like maybe Bombay Nights when I was in my 20s. And it's karma cola. Like East wants to, the East, India, they all want Coca-Cola. Not anymore, but when I was growing up, Coca-Cola wasn't there. The West, we have Coca-Cola, but we need karma, we need inner peace and spirituality. I think that's happening. I think thanks to places like Garrison Institute, I'm sure you'd had half the people in a room like this 10 years ago and 10% of the people 20 years ago. We are all evolving.
So I'm in there every day trying to put money to work. And at the biggest level, I have decided to work in the system. There's other people that I know are trying to work outside the system and change it. I have taken the philosophy with the organization and with the work I do that the system is big, I am going to work in it. But to bring the values, or shall I say the voice that is not in the system to the system. And there's leverage points in different places, in different markets that we work in. But I'll give you just 3 examples that I was thinking of how that plays out in practice, so you can see, how we do our work. We do finance, so we work with the same tenets that I learned in business school. Finance is finance is finance. But 3 examples of where we do it different. 1, impact to exit. What does that mean? That means when we make an investment, we just don't look at the investment today. We think about when we leave that investment, who will take it on. Another way is something that Howard mentioned, is we democratize access. So investing in community, investing in schools, affordable housing, regenerative agriculture is what we invest in. That isn't often an opportunity for everyday people. It's often an opportunity for either maybe philanthropy or the very wealthy. We've created our products so they're democratized. So you can invest if you have $20 or $1,000 in another product. And what we found that does is we have, for example, in our flagship product, over 6,000 investors. But there's a $20 investor in there, and there's a $60 million investor there. And they're sharing the same values, vision, and outcomes. I think there's something really special when that happens. And the third one is we're experimenting with right now, and that's we put, I'll call it lenses on our work. So when I said at the beginning, we start with community and work upwards. A long time ago, we started putting a gender lens on our work. So asking, how does this investment affect the lives of women, either directly or indirectly? And we learned a lot through that. Right now, in partnership with UNICEF, we're starting to think about how does this investment impact the life of a child? And as you know, children are voiceless in a lot of investments. They're not a stakeholder that gets monetized or accrued value. And so, it's like the trees and the fish to me. It's not something we can monetize, ascribe value to, and then sell off. But we all know instinctively they're very important, that they're cared for and nurtured. And so I don't have an answer to how we do it yet. We're trying to figure it out right now. But I think we all know, in our heart that, how an investment impacts the life of a child is crucial.
I bought and sold securities without much thinking. It was just bang, bang, bang all day long. I left that business in December, and I haven't missed it at all, which is pretty hard to believe because there's a tremendous amount of thrill and adrenaline and fun that comes from playing that game every single day. But when I think about the leverage points, again, I'm going to just stick to the theme that works with me that's different from everybody else's, is we all have leverage points. There's a wonderful report out there called the Carbon Bankroll, which explains the carbon impact of where you keep your money. And if you keep your money in a typical money center bank that's lending money to the fossil fuel industry, your carbon footprint is much greater than your footprint would be if you replace your big Escalade with a small Tesla, or if you walk around, we've joked about this before too, if you don't use plastic straws, and all those things you can do individually, those are all important in my opinion, but there are bigger things that you can do. One of the things I talk about in the impact investing that we do at Gratitude Railroad is a concept called climate to the people. Taking care of the climate is hard work. There are lots of things we can do that we can sacrifice for. Bill Gates talks about the green premium. But if we can create the businesses that solve the climate crisis in a manner that's friendly to consumers, that's economically viable, the greatest example, of course, is solar energy, which has become incredibly cheap and viable. That's the way we can have leverage points, if that's the right way of using the word, to fix the system. So again, from my perspective, we should all be clients of Calvert. We should all lead our businesses like Nathan does. We should all be trying to change the world like John is. But we should think about the ways that we can engage our capital in a leveraged fashion that enables the world to be a better place. And it doesn't just have to be climate. There are lots of social justice issues and equality issues and education issues and health and wellness issues that we can address through our investing.
I just want to say, when Jonathan and Deanna were beginning our journey that we took together today, I was thinking about how extraordinary a thing it is to devote 20 years of one's life to creating a space, a sanctuary, a holy place. But to create a place that is not just a space, but also a possibility for the world. That is to create something in space-time. And what we've all witnessed today is a taste of the extraordinary gift that you have created with your amazing colleagues. And I just want us to all give an extraordinary round of applause to the Garrison Institute and to all who have made this possible.
I am yearning to hear more from you. what have we created together today? And also, especially, what is it that your heart wants you to say right now?
I want to give a deep bow of gratitude to all the speakers and all the teachers, but more importantly, I think what's present in my heart is the action piece of what happens after we leave this room. So the seeds, I think, are planted, but also the knowledge that there is like-minded people who care so much for others that they'd show up on a Thursday to spend time to do this contemplation. That to me is peeling a layer of the onion of the poly suffering that we talked about a little bit earlier, but also knowing that you're not alone is very important. So the connection piece feels very large for me right now.
I feel like a witnessing of a crack and like growth and a spillage and maybe a possibility of not recreating the same systems is what has come today for me.
I first went to Garrison Institute in 2009 when I was still a law student, and I've gone there over a dozen times since then for various ways to re-energize and rejuvenate my spirit. And today felt like a really beautiful coming together of the East and the West and the indigenous traditions, and a really beautiful time to really listen to different stories, different paradigms, whether it was economic paradigms or more holistic paradigms, regenerative paradigms. So I'm really coming out of this experience feeling refreshed in a way, really being seen, as well as time to really act. You know, my daily work is really about breaking bias. How do we really overcome stereotyping in our minds using contemplative practices? And I think there's a lot of wisdom here. And just by being with one another in this way, with such open hearts and minds, I think we've each broken our own biases in one way or another. For that, I'm really grateful. So thank you all.
Reflecting back the words of wisdom that have been said today, just a few short observations, and really to begin with this extraordinary paradox of the power of words that Lori shared with us so beautifully from her mother, and Cynthia's reminder to go beyond words, and that if words could have solved the problem would have been solved. I wanted to just reflect back the extraordinarily beautiful example of Monica's reminding us of how hard metamorphosis actually is, because we are going into the unknown, into the imaginal. I wanted to mention that Tioka-san's words of how we have too much knowledge but are starved with wisdom, and that we are born becoming earth and we die becoming earth. And finally, I wanted to mention Dan's extraordinary phrase that the splinter in the soul of humanity is the lethal lie of the separate self. And that while we are acknowledging individuals like Deanna and Jonathan and Karen and all of those at the Garrison Institute, we are all part of this possibility that is the Garrison Institute. And that we can go beyond that lie and to find our in relationship, as Tioka-san said, our relationship back to the earth, to one another, and to the generations that come. Thank you all so much.